Howard Reynolds stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office overlooking the skyline of Oak Ridge, Connecticut. At 65, he commanded respect in every room he entered. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his custom Italian suit impeccable. As the CEO of Reynolds Development, he had transformed the landscape of this once sleepy town into a thriving business hub. "Congratulations, Howard," said James, his vice president, handing him a glass of scotch. "The Westside Plaza deal is officially closed. That's another $40 million for the company." Howard smiled, taking the glass. "That's why we're the best, James. Where others see obstacles, we see opportunities." The phone on his desk rang. Howard checked the caller ID and silenced it with a swift motion. "Eleanor again?" James asked, his tone careful. "Anniversary dinner or something," Howard replied dismissively. "I told her I'd be working late. She knows how important this deal is." What Howard didn't say was that he had plans later that evening, but not with his wife of 40 years. Vanessa Taylor, his 24-year-old executive assistant, would be waiting for him at their usual hotel suite downtown. Young, ambitious, and beautiful, she made him feel alive in ways Eleanor hadn't in decades. Across town, Eleanor Reynolds sat in the consultation room of Dr. Patricia Lewis, her hands trembling as she received the news. "The tests confirm it, Eleanor. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer." "I'm so sorry." Dr. Patricia, her friend of 30 years, reached across her desk to hold Eleanor's hand. Eleanor nodded slowly, her elegant features composed despite the devastating news. "How long do I have?" 6 months, maybe 8 with aggressive treatment." "But Eleanor, you need to tell Howard." "You'll need support. No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm despite her pale complexion. "Not yet. I need time to think." Later that evening, Eleanor moved silently through their mansion, placing a small donation box by the door for her weekly visit to the Oak Ridge Senior Center. The house was quiet and empty, as it often was. She passed the wall of photographs Howard receiving business awards, cutting ribbons at new developments, shaking hands with politicians. Among them were older photos, their wedding day, the birth of their daughter Mia, family vacations from when Howard still made time for family. Eleanor paused at a photo of Howard holding 3-year-old Mia on his shoulders, both laughing. That man had disappeared decades ago, replaced by someone consumed with success and status. In their bedroom, Eleanor opened her jewelry box and removed a small key hidden beneath the velvet lining. She walked to her closet and unlocked a small safe hidden behind her winter clothes. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a stack of legal papers. For 2 years, she had been writing in this journal, documenting her feelings, her marriage, and increasingly, her plans. Ever since she had accidentally discovered Howard's first affair 15 years ago, she had been quietly observing the man her husband had become. Eleanor sat at her vanity, opened the journal, and began to write. "My dear friend Patricia confirmed what I already suspected. I have 6 months, perhaps less. Howard doesn't know, and for now, that's how it will remain. I've lived in the shadow of his ambition for too long. Now, with the time I have left, I will arrange my final gift to him, not the gift he would want, but the one he needs. I still remember the man I married, the man who exists somewhere beneath the power and the money. My last act will be to give him a chance to find that man again, to reconnect with Mia, to understand what truly matters before it's too late for him too." She closed the journal, feeling a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow she would call her lawyer and finalize the changes to her will. Not out of vengeance, but out of love, a tough, uncompromising love that Howard would initially mistake for cruelty. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror, tucking a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "One last chance," she whispered to her reflection. "I'm giving him one last chance to remember who he really is." Is this story making you feel emotional already? We're just getting started. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from as we continue this shocking journey of betrayal and redemption. 3 months passed in a blur for Eleanor. Her condition deteriorated quickly despite her attempts to hide it. She made excuses for her weight loss, blamed her fatigue on age, and scheduled her treatments when Howard was busy with work, which was almost always. Dr. Patricia urged her repeatedly to tell her husband, but Eleanor was resolute. "He's too busy living his life to notice I'm losing mine," she told Patricia during one of her final visits. On a crisp October morning, while Howard was meeting Vanessa at their usual hotel, Eleanor Reynolds passed away peacefully in her sleep. The housekeeper found her and made the difficult call to Howard. Howard was buttoning his shirt when his phone rang. Vanessa watched from the bed, scrolling through her social media feed. "What?" Howard's voice sharpened. "When?" A long pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Problem with another deal?" Vanessa asked, not looking up from her phone. Howard's face had gone pale. "Eleanor is dead." Vanessa finally looked up, her expression showing mild surprise rather than genuine sadness. "Oh. I'm sorry." She hesitated before adding, "Will you need me at the office to reschedule your meetings?" Howard stared at her for a moment, as if seeing something that hadn't registered before. "No," he said finally. "But I'll need you for the funeral. It would look strange if my assistant wasn't there." The news of Eleanor Reynolds' death spread quickly through Oak Ridge. The local newspaper ran a front-page story highlighting her charitable work and community service. For 3 decades, Eleanor had quietly dedicated herself to the Oak Ridge Senior Center, organizing fundraisers, visiting residents, and even personally funding several programs when the center faced budget cuts. The funeral was scheduled for 3 days later at St. Mark's Church, the largest in town. Howard spent those days handling arrangements like another business transaction, focused on appearances rather than grieving. He insisted on the most expensive casket, the finest flowers, and a reception at the Grand Oak Ridge Hotel. On the day of the funeral, the church overflowed with mourners, most of whom Howard barely recognized. Community members, senior center residents, charity organizers, and dozens of people whose lives Eleanor had touched filed in, many openly weeping. Howard stood stoically at the front, greeting people with handshakes and practiced words of thanks. Then the church fell silent as heads turned toward the entrance. Howard looked up to see what had caused the sudden hush. Mia Reynolds, his estranged daughter, walked down the aisle. At 38, she was the image of her mother, the same graceful posture, the same compassionate eyes, though now reddened from tears. Howard hadn't seen her in 5 years, not since he'd expressed his disapproval of her marriage to David, a music teacher Howard considered beneath the Reynolds family status. Mia walked past Howard without acknowledgement, placing a single white rose on her mother's casket before taking a seat in the front row, leaving an obvious space between herself and where Howard would sit. The uncomfortable moment was eclipsed when gasps rippled through the congregation. Howard turned to see Vanessa entering the church. She wore a black dress that, while technically appropriate for a funeral, was fitted in a way that drew attention. More shocking was the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a piece Howard had recently given her, photographed multiple times when they'd been seen together at restaurants. Murmurs spread through the church as Vanessa walked confidently down the aisle, taking her place beside Howard as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Smartphones discreetly rose throughout the congregation as people captured the audacious moment. Mia's face hardened at the sight. Across the aisle, Martha Wilson, Eleanor's closest friend from the senior center, fixed Howard with a gaze of pure disgust. The service proceeded, with friends and community members sharing stories of Eleanor's kindness and generosity. Howard delivered a brief, formal eulogy that spoke more of Eleanor's social standing than her character. Throughout it all, Vanessa remained by his side, occasionally placing her hand on his arm in a gesture that appeared supportive but struck many as possessive. As they left the church, photographers from the local paper captured the moment, Howard Reynolds leading his young assistant down the steps while his daughter walked separately, alone in her grief. Howard remained oblivious to the scandal he was creating, to the whispers, the stares, and the damage being done to the Reynolds name. A name Eleanor had worked quietly for decades to associate with charity rather than mere wealth. Are you feeling outraged by Howard's behavior? So are we. Tell us in the comments what city you're watching this shocking story from. 3 days after the funeral, Howard arrived at the offices of Blanchard and Associates for the reading of Eleanor's will. He expected a straightforward process after all. They had the standard arrangement where everything passed to the surviving spouse. His only concern was making sure the Reynolds Foundation, the tax write-off charity overseen by Eleanor, would transition smoothly under his control. Howard sat confidently in the leather chair across from Thomas Blanchard, their family attorney for 30 years. He was surprised to see Martha Wilson already seated in the corner, her stern face revealing nothing. "Why is she here?" Howard asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "Mrs. Wilson is here at Eleanor's specific request," Thomas explained, adjusting his glasses. "As are several others who should be arriving shortly." Before Howard could object, the door opened again. Mia entered, followed by Jackson Hayes, the director of the Oak Ridge Senior Center, and Dr. Patricia Lewis. Howard shifted uncomfortably as they took seats around the large conference table, all avoiding his gaze. "Well, let's get started," Howard said impatiently. "I have meetings this afternoon." Thomas cleared his throat. "Before we begin, Howard, I want to make it clear that everything we're about to discuss reflects Eleanor's careful deliberation and sound mind. I personally verified her mental capacity multiple times during the preparation of these documents." Howard frowned. "What are you talking about?" "It's a standard will." Thomas placed a thick folder on the table. "Not exactly. What followed would be reported in the Oak Ridge Tribune the next day as the Reynolds reckoning. Eleanor had completely rewritten her will 6 months before her death. The family mansion, which had been in Eleanor's family for generations before her marriage to Howard, was to be sold, with proceeds going to the expansion of the Oak Ridge Senior Center's facilities. Her personal fortune, substantially larger than Howard had realized due to family investments Eleanor had managed privately, was to be transferred to a new foundation headed by Mia, dedicated to supporting elderly community members and young caregivers. As for Howard, he would receive a monthly stipend of $3,000, enough to live modestly, but nowhere near the luxury he was accustomed to. This stipend was conditional on his completion of 1,000 hours of community service at the Oak Ridge Senior Center. "This is ridiculous," Howard interrupted, standing up abruptly. "She can't do this. This will never stand up in court." "I assure you it will," Thomas replied calmly. Eleanor consulted with 3 separate legal teams to ensure everything was ironclad. The properties in question were always hers, Howard. The prenuptial agreement you both signed protected them. "What prenup?" "That was 40 years ago. It expired." "Actually, it didn't. You renewed it on your 20th anniversary, page 7, paragraph 4. You signed it during that party at the country club. Eleanor had it notarized that night." Howard vaguely remembered signing something Eleanor had insisted on during their anniversary celebration, but he'd been busy networking with potential clients and hadn't bothered to read it. "There's more," Thomas continued, removing a sealed envelope from the folder. "Upon completion of your 1,000 hours of service, you are to receive this." Eleanor was very specific that it remained sealed until then. Howard sat in stunned silence as Thomas finished reviewing the details. The mansion was to be vacated within 30 days. His company shares remained his, but the building that housed Reynolds Development was part of Eleanor's family portfolio and would be sold. As the meeting concluded, the others filed out silently. Mia left without a word to her father. Only Martha lingered. "She knew, Howard," Martha said quietly. "She knew about all of them. Every mistress, every affair. She kept a record of it all, going back 15 years. Howard stared at her, momentarily speechless. "She didn't do this out of hatred," Martha continued. "Remember that when you're cursing her name." That evening, Howard met Vanessa at Bellini's, Oak Ridge's most exclusive restaurant. He'd planned to reassure her that nothing would change, that this setback was temporary. He'd fight the will, retain control, and they would continue as before. But when he arrived, Vanessa was already seated across from Richard Blackwood, Howard's longtime business rival. "Howard," she said with a cold smile when he approached the table. Perfect timing. I was just telling Richard the first won't be coming into work tomorrow. Or ever again, actually. The diamond bracelet he'd given her glinted on her wrist as she placed her hand over Richard's. You understand business, Howard, Richard said with a smirk. It's never personal, just a matter of recognizing the better opportunity. Howard stood there, the restaurant's other patrons watching the scene unfold as his world continued to crumble around him. 1 month after the reading of Eleanor's will, Howard sat alone in his new apartment on the unfashionable east side of Oak Ridge. The space was a tenth the size of his former mansion, with rental furniture and bare walls. On the coffee table lay a stack of papers, his lawyer's latest update on the feudal battle against Eleanor's ironclad will. After 3 different legal opinions had confirmed what Thomas had said, Howard had to accept reality. Eleanor had outmaneuvered him, using the very tactics he'd employed in business for decades. He'd been forced to move out of the mansion, watching as movers packed up 40 years of accumulated luxury. The worst blow had come yesterday when investors in Reynolds Development began pulling out, nervous about the company's future after news of Howard's financial reversal spread. The stock had dropped 30% in a single day. Howard opened the cabinet above his small kitchen sink, removing a bottle of scotch and a single glass. On the counter lay his daily medication, blood pressure pills he'd neglected to take for 3 days. Beside them sat his phone, which hadn't rung with a personal call since the news broke. He poured a full glass of scotch, then opened the pill bottle and emptied its contents into his palm. He stared at the small white pills, then at the alcohol. It would be so easy to end this humiliation, to escape the pitying looks and whispered conversations that followed him around town. Howard raised the glass to his lips, the pills still clutched in his other hand. Just as he was about to toss them back, his phone rang. He ignored it, but it rang again. And again. On the 4th call, he glanced at the screen, unknown number. With an irritated sigh, Howard set down the glass and answered. What? Howard Reynolds? This is Martha Wilson from the Oak Ridge Senior Center. Howard nearly hung up. How did you get this number? Eleanor gave it to me months ago, Martha replied. She said I might need it. If you're calling about the community service, I'm calling because Eleanor asked me to check on you exactly 1 month after the will reading, Martha interrupted. She was concerned you might do something rash. Howard glanced at the pills in his hand, a chill running through him. How could Eleanor have known? I have nothing to say to you, Howard said coldly. Then just listen, Martha replied. I'm at Oak Ridge Coffee downtown. I'll be here for the next hour. Eleanor left something for you that wasn't included in the will reading. It's your choice whether you want to see it. Before Howard could respond, she hung up. Howard dumped the pills back into their bottle. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for any connection to his old life, propelled him out the door 30 minutes later. The coffee shop was nearly empty when he arrived. Martha sat at a corner table, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a cardigan that had seen better days. Nothing about her suggested she now helped manage a multi-million-dollar foundation. You came, she said as Howard approached. No smile, no warmth, just acknowledgement. What did she leave? Howard demanded, remaining standing. Martha gestured to the empty chair. Sit first. You look terrible. Reluctantly, Howard sat. Up close, he could see that Martha's stern expression carried something else, not pity, but assessment. Before I give you what Eleanor left, I need to tell you something, Martha said. I didn't agree with what she did. Howard leaned forward, sensing an ally at last. I thought she was too generous, Martha continued, dashing his hope. After what you put her through, I would have left you nothing. Howard started to stand, but Martha's next words froze him. She loved you until the end, Howard. That's why she did this. Taking everything from me was an act of love? Howard scoffed. She didn't take everything, Martha replied. She took the things that were poisoning you. The things that turned you into someone she no longer recognized. Martha reached into her bag and removed a small photo. She slid it across the table. It showed a much younger Howard holding newborn Mia, looking at her with pure adoration. She kept this in her wallet, Martha said. She believed that man still existed somewhere inside you. I told her she was delusional. Howard stared at the photo, unexpectedly moved. I promised her I would try to help you, Martha continued. Not because I like you, but because I loved her. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to start your community service tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. sharp. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty. And if I refuse? Howard challenged, though with less conviction than he intended. Then you continue your path to self-destruction, and I tell Eleanor when I see her again that I tried. Martha stood. Your choice, Howard. But ask yourself this: what else do you have left to lose? And what might you gain by trying something completely different with whatever time you have left? She placed a business card on the table with the senior center's address. Eleanor believed you could find your way back to being the man in that photo, Martha said. I'm not so sure. But I know this: she spent her last months creating a path for you. The least you could do is take the first step. With that, Martha left, leaving Howard alone with the photo and a decision that would change the course of what remained of his life. Howard stood at the entrance of the Oak Ridge Senior Center at precisely 8 a.m. the following day. The building was older than he expected, a converted Victorian house with a newer wing added to the back. A hand-painted sign welcomed visitors, and a small garden with benches lined the walkway. He'd chosen his clothing carefully: jeans he'd purchased the day before, having owned none previously, and a plain button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He wanted to appear humble but not defeated. Howard Reynolds might be down, but he still had his dignity. Didn't think you'd actually show up, Martha said, appearing at the doorway. She handed him a clipboard. Sign in here. This is how we'll track your hours. Howard signed his name, noticing how out of place his signature looked on the volunteer sheet. What exactly will I be doing? He asked, trying to sound casual. Whatever needs doing, Martha replied. Today, you'll start in the kitchen helping with breakfast cleanup. Then maintenance needs help fixing chairs in the recreation room. After lunch, you'll be reading to residents who have vision problems. Howard stared at her. I'm a CEO, not a handyman or storyteller. Not anymore, you're not, Martha said flatly. Here, you're just Howard, volunteer. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be. She led him through the door. 1,000 hours is a long time to be miserable. The kitchen was hot and smelled of bacon and disinfectant. 2 women in their 60s were loading industrial dishwashers while a younger man wiped down tables. This is Howard, our new volunteer, Martha announced. Carmen, would you show him the ropes? Carmen, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes, nodded. The younger man looked up, his face hardening with recognition. You've got to be kidding, he said. Howard Reynolds? The same Howard Reynolds who made his wife's life hell. Jackson, Martha warned. No, Jackson continued, pointing his finger at Howard. Eleanor was a saint who gave everything to this place. And you brought your girlfriend to her funeral. The kitchen went silent. Howard felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. Jackson Hayes is our director, Martha explained to Howard. And Eleanor's dear friend. Jackson, Howard is here to fulfill the terms of Eleanor's will. We will all treat him with the same respect we show every person who walks through those doors. Jackson threw his towel into the sink. I'll be in my office. He stalked out, brushing past Howard roughly. The morning passed in a blur of unfamiliar tasks. Howard washed dishes, scrubbed pots, and hauled garbage to the dumpster behind the building. By noon, his back ached, his hands were red from hot water and harsh soap, and sweat had soaked through his new shirt. After a quick lunch that he ate alone in the corner of the staff room, Howard reported to the maintenance supervisor, a retired contractor named Bill who seemed unimpressed by Howard's former status. Ever use a screwdriver? Bill asked, handing Howard a toolbox. I have people who use screwdrivers for me, Howard replied. Bill snorted. Not anymore, you don't. Let's see if you can learn to use your hands for something besides signing checks. For 2 hours, Howard struggled with basic tools, tightening screws on wobbly dining chairs while residents watched with amusement. His fingers were clumsy and used to such tasks, and Bill's patience wore thin. That's enough, Bill finally said. Go see Martha for your next assignment before you hurt yourself. Martha led Howard to the sunroom, where several elderly residents sat in wheelchairs or with walkers nearby. These folks can't read for themselves anymore, but they love being read to. The books on that shelf are their favorites. Howard surveyed the room nervously. I'm not good at this sort of thing. Then get good at it, Martha replied simply, leaving him alone with his new audience. Howard awkwardly selected a book and sat in the reading chair. The residents watched him expectantly. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice stiff and formal. After a few minutes, an elderly woman with clouded eyes interrupted. You're new here, she said. What's your name, dear? Howard, he answered. Howard, she repeated, a smile spreading across her face. My Robert had a voice just like yours. Deep and strong. She reached out a trembling hand. Come closer so I can see you. Confused, Howard leaned forward. The woman's hand touched his face gently, her fingers exploring his features. Yes, she said softly. You remind me of him. He's been gone 20 years now. Do you know what I miss most? Not the big things. Just the sound of his voice reading to me before bed. Tears filled her eyes, and to Howard's shock, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. For the first time in decades, he felt genuine compassion stirring within him. I'm Betty, the woman said, patting the chair beside her. Sit here where I can hear you better, and start the book again, Howard. And this time, read it like you mean it. 2 weeks into his community service, Howard had settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable in his previous life. He arrived at the center by 7:30 a.m., helped serve breakfast, and spent his mornings on whatever tasks Martha assigned him, usually the most unpleasant ones. Today was no exception. Howard found himself on his knees in the men's bathroom, scrubbing toilets and mopping floors. The work was humiliating, but he'd stopped complaining after the first week. Complaining, he discovered, only earned him more difficult assignments. Mr. Reynolds? A voice called from the doorway. Howard looked up, toilet brush in hand, to see Sophie Martinez, one of the younger nurses at the center. In her mid-30s, with warm brown eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, Sophie had been one of the few staff members who treated him with basic civility. Your phone's been ringing nonstop in the break room, she said. Thought it might be important. Howard thanked her, quickly rinsed his hands, and hurried to retrieve his phone. 8 missed calls, all from James, his VP. He stepped outside to return the call, anxiety building. James, what's going on? Howard, where have you been? Blackwood Partners made a hostile takeover offer this morning. They're offering shareholders 30% under market value, but after last week's drop, some of the board members are considering it. Howard felt the blood drain from his face. They can't do that. I still control 40% of the shares. That's just it, Howard. Your banks are calling in your loans since your personal assets have been liquidated. If you can't cover them, your shares could be seized and sold at auction. Blackwood knows this. That's why they're moving now. Stall them, Howard ordered, his CEO voice returning instinctively. Tell them I'll have a counter-strategy by tomorrow. But as he ended the call, Howard realized the hollowness of his promise. His legal team had already exhausted every option fighting Eleanor's will. His personal accounts were nearly empty, with only his monthly stipend to live on. The empire he'd spent 4 decades building was slipping through his fingers. He returned to the bathroom, his movements mechanical as he finished cleaning. When lunch break came, he sat alone on a bench in the garden, too distracted to eat. Mind if I join you? Howard looked up to see an elderly man with a walker making his way toward the bench. The man sat down with a grateful sigh, placing a brown bag lunch beside him. "George Sullivan," the man said, extending a gnarled hand. "You're Howard Reynolds. Been watching you mop floors for 2 weeks now. Quite a change from running Reynolds Development." Howard shook his hand warily. "You know who I am?" "Everyone knows who you are," George said, unwrapping a sandwich. "I used to be in real estate myself, back in the 80s and 90s. Sullivan Properties. Much smaller operation than yours, but we did all right." Howard suddenly placed the name. "Sullivan Properties. You owned that block on Elm Street that I wanted for the Riverview development." George chuckled. "That's right. I turned down your offer 3 times. You were holding out for more money," Howard said. "No," George corrected. "I was holding out because you wanted to demolish historical buildings for luxury condos. I eventually sold to the Historical Preservation Society instead." Howard remembered his frustration at the time. "You took a loss on that deal." "In dollars, yes. But I gained something else." George took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "I heard Blackwood's making a move on your company." Howard stared at him. "How could you possibly know that? This place is full of grandparents whose children and grandchildren work all over town. News travels fast." George turned to face Howard directly. "What are you going to do about it?" "There's nothing I can do. My assets are frozen or gone. The banks are calling in my loans." George nodded, considering this. "You know, I've watched you these past 2 weeks. You clean toilets with the same intensity you probably applied to million-dollar deals." Howard wasn't sure if it was a compliment or criticism. "Richard Blackwood is a shark," George continued. "Always has been. But he's got one weakness: he panics when deals look like they might go public in a negative way." Howard's attention sharpened. "What do you mean?" "His investors are all old money. Very concerned with appearances. Back in '98, I threatened to go to the press about how one of his developments was displacing a homeless shelter. He withdrew his bid within 24 hours. For the first time in weeks, Howard felt a spark of his old strategic thinking. "Are you suggesting I threatened Blackwood?" "I'm not suggesting anything," George said innocently. "Just reminiscing about the old days." He pulled a business card from his pocket. "My grandson works at the Oak Ridge Tribune now. Business section. He loves writing about corporate ethics. Or the lack thereof." Howard took the card, a plan already forming in his mind. "Why would you help me?" Howard asked. George stood, steadying himself on his walker. "I didn't like your business tactics, Howard. But what Blackwood does to companies after he acquires them, stripping assets, laying off loyal employees, that's worse. And besides," he added with a wink, "Eleanor would have wanted a fair fight." As George shuffled away, Howard realized he'd found an unexpected ally in this strange new world, and perhaps the first step toward saving what remained of his life's work. 3 weeks after his conversation with George, Howard had settled into a rhythm at the senior center. His days were still filled with mundane tasks: serving meals, reading to residents, helping with physical therapy sessions, but he approached them with less resentment. George's advice had helped him fend off Blackwood's initial takeover attempt by anonymously leaking information about Blackwood's history of post-acquisition layoffs to the business press. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought him time. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Martha approached Howard as he was organizing the center's small library. "I need your help with something," she said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "The storage room needs clearing out. We're getting a donation of new medical equipment tomorrow and need the space." Howard followed her down a narrow hallway to a cluttered room filled with boxes, old furniture, and miscellaneous items. "Start with those boxes against the back wall," Martha instructed. "Anything labeled for donation goes to the van out back. The rest needs to be organized on these shelves." She handed him a clipboard. "And inventory everything. I'll check back in an hour." Howard sighed as the door closed behind her. The room was dusty and poorly lit, clearly another of Martha's tests to see if he would complain. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. As he sorted through the boxes, Howard found mostly what he expected: outdated medical supplies, holiday decorations, craft materials. Then he came across a cardboard box labeled simply ER Personal. His hands froze. ER Eleanor Reynolds. Howard sat on a nearby stool, placing the box carefully on his lap. Inside were items that had obviously come from Eleanor's office at the center-framed photos: a coffee mug with "World's Best Volunteer" printed on it, a few books on caregiving, and a small wooden box. The wooden box was locked, but a tiny key taped to the bottom caught his eye. With slightly trembling hands, Howard opened it. Inside lay several small journals bound in blue leather, along with a stack of envelopes tied with ribbon. The envelopes were addressed, but unstamped, some to him, some to Mia. Howard opened the most recent journal, recognizing Eleanor's elegant handwriting immediately. The entry was dated just 2 months before her death. Dr. Patricia says the treatments aren't working anymore. We've agreed to stop them and focus on comfort care. I haven't told anyone else yet. There's still so much to arrange, so much to prepare. Howard remains oblivious. He hasn't noticed my weight loss or how little I eat at dinner. Last night, he forgot about our dinner plans entirely. When he came home past midnight, he smelled of her perfume again. Howard's chest tightened as he turned the page. I've finalized the changes to my will today. Thomas thinks I'm being too harsh, but he doesn't understand. This isn't punishment, it's Howard's last chance. I've watched him become someone I don't recognize, someone consumed by power and money and ego. The man I married is still in there somewhere. I have to believe that. This plan is my final act of love for him, even if he'll see it as cruelty at first. Howard flipped back further in the journal, finding entries that spanned the past 2 years. As he read, the full picture emerged. Eleanor had discovered her cancer shortly after their 40th anniversary, the anniversary Howard had forgotten because he was closing a deal in Boston. She had made the conscious choice not to tell him, using her remaining time to methodically document his affairs, change her will, and set up the foundation with Mia. Most surprisingly, the journals contained no bitterness, no hatred. Instead, they revealed Eleanor's deep sadness at watching the man she loved lose himself, and her determination to create a pathway for his redemption after she was gone. I still remember the Howard who read stories to Mia every night, no matter how late he got home, one entry read. The man who brought me wildflowers on ordinary Tuesdays, who said his greatest achievement wasn't his business but the family we built. That man is worth saving, even from himself. Especially from himself. Howard didn't realize he was crying until tears fell onto the page. He hastily wiped them away, afraid of damaging the journal. When was the last time he had cried? He couldn't remember. He found himself drawn to an envelope with his name on it, dated a month before Eleanor's death. With unsteady hands, he opened it and began to read. My dearest Howard, if you're reading this, then you've begun the journey I've set before you. I know you're angry with me right now. You feel betrayed, humiliated, perhaps even hate me for what I've done. That's okay. Anger has always been easier for you than pain. But I want you to know this was never about punishment. It was about giving you the one thing your money couldn't buy, a chance to rediscover yourself. I've watched you disappear over the years, Howard. Inch by inch, deal by deal, you've become a stranger wearing my husband's face. I stayed because I always hoped you'd find your way back. Now that I can't stay anymore, this is my last gift to you. I still love you, Howard. I love the man who held my hand through 20 hours of labor when Mia was born. The man who taught our daughter to ride a bike, who danced with me in the kitchen when you're first big. Deal closed. He's still in there. Find him before it's too late for you both. All my love, Eleanor. This powerful revelation touched your heart? Our story continues with even more shocking twists. Subscribe now to make sure you don't miss the continued journey of Howard's redemption. Howard spent the next 3 days in a fog, Eleanor's words echoing in his mind. He continued his duties at the center mechanically, but his thoughts remained with the journals he'd discovered. Each night in his small apartment, he read more entries, piecing together the silent suffering and careful planning of his wife's final years. On Friday afternoon, as Howard was helping a resident with physical therapy exercises, Sophie approached him. "Martha would like to see you in her office," she said. Then, noticing his distracted expression, she added, "Are you okay? You've seemed different this week." Howard nodded. "I'm fine. Just thinking about some things." In Martha's office, Howard found her reviewing the center's monthly budget, a deep frown on her face. "You wanted to see me?" he asked. Martha looked up. "You found Eleanor's journals, didn't you?" Howard wasn't surprised she knew. "Yes. And I understand now what she was trying to do." He hesitated. "I don't know if it will work, but I understand." Martha steadied him for a moment. "Good. Then maybe you're ready for the next step." She slid a piece of paper across her desk. On it was an address. "This is where your daughter lives." Howard stared at the paper. "Mia? You want me to see Mia?" "Eleanor wanted you to see Mia," Martha corrected. "She hoped that once you'd had some time here, once you started to change, you might rebuild that relationship too." "She won't want to see me," Howard said, but he took the paper anyway. "Probably not," Martha agreed. "But Eleanor believed it was worth trying. The choice is yours." The following morning, Howard stood on the sidewalk outside a modest two-story house in a quiet neighborhood across town. The garden was well maintained, with spring flowers beginning to bloom. A wind chime tinkled gently from the porch. It was nothing like the ostentatious homes Howard had always lived in, but it looked comfortable. Homey. He approached the door hesitantly and knocked. After a long moment, it opened. Mia stood there, her expression shifting from curiosity to cold recognition. She wore a loose-fitting dress, and Howard was startled to see the visible curve of pregnancy beneath it. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not moving to invite him in. Howard faltered. What could he say? "Martha Wilson gave me your address." "I know who you are," a man's voice called from inside. David, Mia's husband, appeared behind her. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "What do you want?" Howard had never approved of David. A public school music teacher seemed an inadequate match for the daughter of Howard Reynolds. Now, seeing the gentle way David supported Mia, Howard felt the first twinge of shame for his past judgment. "I don't want anything," Howard said. "I just thought, maybe we could talk." "Now you want to talk?" Mia's voice trembled with emotion. "After 5 years of silence? After what you did at Mom's funeral?" Howard winced. "I know I've made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Mia laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call them? You broke Mom's heart for years. You missed my wedding because you couldn't accept that I married for love instead of status. And then her voice broke, you brought that woman to Mom's funeral." "I'm sorry," Howard said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to change." Mia's hand went protectively to her belly. "Why now, Dad? Because Moms will force you? Because you need money?" "No," Howard said, though he knew she had every reason to doubt him. "Because I found Mom's journals. I read what she wrote. About me. About us." He hesitated. "About what?" She hoped would happen after she was gone. Something flickered in Mia's eyes, not forgiveness, but perhaps recognition of the sincerity in his voice. "Did you know?" Howard asked softly. "About her cancer? That she was sick for so long?" Mia exchanged a look with David. "Not until the end," she admitted. "She made me promise not to tell you. She said you were too busy with your own life to be bothered with hers." The words hit Howard like a physical blow. "There's something else you should know," Mia said after a moment. "Richard Blackwood came to see me last week." He's challenging Mom's will, claiming she wasn't mentally competent when she made the changes. What? Howard's mind raced. He can't do that. He says he can. He says he has medical records suggesting her illness affected her judgment. Mia's eyes narrowed. He also implied that if I cooperated, he could ensure I received a more appropriate settlement than running a foundation. He's lying, Howard said firmly. Eleanor was completely lucid until the very end. And if he's claiming otherwise, he's committing fraud. Howard's mind suddenly clicked into strategic mode, not for his own benefit, but for Mia's. I have information about some of Blackwood's less ethical business practices. It could help if he pursues this. David spoke up. Why would you help us? What's in it for you? It was a fair question. The old Howard would always have had an angle, a way to benefit personally. Nothing, Howard answered truthfully. But it's what Eleanor would have wanted. And maybe. He looked at Mia's pregnant belly. Maybe I'd like the chance to know my grandchild someday. Mia didn't invite him in that day. But she didn't slam the door in his face either. As Howard walked back to his car, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, not victory or satisfaction, but the quiet hope that something broken might, with time and effort, begin to heal. 2 months had passed since Howard began his community service. He had logged over 800 hours, settling into a routine that now felt almost comfortable. The residents knew him by name, some even requesting him specifically for reading hours or assistance with activities. Even Jackson's open hostility had mellowed to a cool professional distance. One evening, Howard was helping to serve dinner when he noticed Jackson and Martha in an intense conversation in the corner of the dining room. Jackson's face was flushed, and Martha kept shaking her head. Howard couldn't hear their words, but the body language was clear they were arguing about something serious. After the residents had been served, Howard approached Sophie, who was checking medication charts at the nurse's station. "Is everything okay with Jackson and Martha?" he asked quietly. Sophie glanced over at them, then back at Howard. She hesitated before answering. "It's not really my place to say." "I'm just concerned," Howard said. "They seem upset." Sophie sighed. "The center is having financial problems. Serious ones. Jackson has been trying to handle it himself, but..." She shrugged. "Bills keep coming, and donations are down since Eleanor passed away." Howard nodded, thanking her for the information. Later, as he was helping clean up the kitchen, Martha appeared at his side. "I need you to lock up tonight," she said, handing him a set of keys. "I have to take Jackson home. He's not feeling well." Howard raised an eyebrow. "Is he okay?" "Just exhausted," Martha replied, but her expression suggested there was more to the story. "Make sure all the doors are secured before you leave." After Martha left with Jackson, Howard completed his closing duties. As he passed Jackson's office, he noticed the light was still on and the door ajar. He should just turn off the light and lock up, but curiosity got the better of him. Inside, the usually tidy office was in disarray. Papers covered the desk, and several past due notices were prominently displayed. Howard scanned them. Quickly, utility bills, medical supply invoices, and most alarmingly, a letter from the bank regarding the center's mortgage. Among the papers was a folder labeled Eleanor Reynolds Memorial Wing. Howard opened it to find architectural plans for an expansion of the center, along with a pledge letter signed by Eleanor 3 months before her death, promising a substantial donation to fund the project. A handwritten note from Jackson was paperclipped to the pledge. Construction began based on Eleanor's commitment. Need to find alternative funding ASAP or face closure. The situation suddenly became clear. Eleanor had promised a major donation to expand the center, and Jackson had begun the project on the strength of that promise. But when she died suddenly, the pledge went unfulfilled, leaving the center in financial jeopardy. Howard carefully replaced the documents and locked the office, his mind racing. Back at his apartment, he spread his own financial records on the kitchen table. His stipend from Eleanor's will was barely enough to cover his modest living expenses. His company shares were frozen in legal limbo as Blackwood continued his takeover attempts. Besides his watch, a vintage Patek Philippe worth about $50,000, he had no liquid assets left. The next morning, Howard arrived at the center earlier than usual. He found Jackson in his office, looking exhausted. "We need to talk," Howard said without preamble. Jackson sighed. "I don't have time for I know about the financial problems," Howard interrupted. "And about Eleanor's pledge for the new wing." Jackson's face hardened. "You had no right to go through my office." "I didn't have to. It's obvious something's wrong, and Sophie confirmed it." Howard sat down across from Jackson. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" "That your wife promised to save this place, and now we're facing closure? That the residents might lose their home because the promised funds never materialized?" Jackson laughed bitterly. "What good would telling you do?" "I might be able to help," Howard said. "Unless you've got $500,000 hidden somewhere, I doubt that." Howard leaned forward. "I don't have money, but I have experience. I've rescued dozens of businesses from financial collapse. Let me look at the books, talk to the bank. There might be options you haven't considered." Jackson studied Howard for a long moment. "Why would you want to help?" It was a fair question. 2 months ago, Howard wouldn't have cared if the center closed. But now, the thought of Betty with nowhere to go, of George and the other residents displaced, of the staff losing their jobs, it bothered him in a way he couldn't have imagined before. "Because Eleanor cared about this place," Howard said finally. "And because I'm starting to see why." Reluctantly, Jackson shared the center's financial records. The situation was worse than Howard had feared. Construction costs had exceeded estimates, donations had fallen, and the center had taken a high-interest loan to cover the shortfall. Without immediate intervention, foreclosure was imminent. That afternoon, Howard met with Sophie during her break. "I need to know everything about the center's operations costs, staffing, what services are essential, and what could be modified." Sophie looked surprised. "Are you really trying to help?" "Yes," Howard said simply. "I am." As Sophie began explaining the center's day-to-day operations, Howard felt an unfamiliar sensation, a sense of purpose unrelated to personal gain. For the first time in decades, he was using his business acumen not to increase his wealth or status, but to protect something valuable to others. The irony wasn't lost on him. Eleanor had taken away his fortune and given him menial work as punishment. Yet here he was, voluntarily taking on the center's financial crisis, applying the very skills that had made him successful before. Perhaps this, too, was part of Eleanor's plan all along. 3 weeks. After discovering the center's financial crisis, Howard had immersed himself in rescue efforts. He negotiated with suppliers for extended payment terms, reorganized staffing schedules to reduce overtime costs, and drafted grant applications to local foundations. But these measures were merely bandages on a hemorrhaging wound. The center needed a major infusion of cash to survive. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood had intensified his attacks. The legal challenge to Eleanor's will had begun, with Blackwood's lawyers claiming she had been mentally incompetent when making the changes. They'd even produced a doctor, not Eleanor's actual physician, who was willing to testify that terminal cancer could have affected her judgment. The pressure came to a head on a sunny Saturday in June. The Reynolds Foundation, now run by Mia, was hosting a ribbon-cutting ceremony for its first major Initiative A scholarship program for nursing students who committed to elder care after graduation. The event was being held in the garden of the senior center, bringing together 2 parts of Eleanor's legacy. Howard arrived early to help set up chairs. He'd been invited not by Mia, but by Martha, who thought his presence might help counter Blackwood's narrative about Eleanor's mental state. "You look nervous," Martha observed as Howard adjusted his tie. He was wearing his only remaining suit. The others had been sold to cover living expenses. "I haven't seen Mia since our conversation at her house," Howard admitted. "And I've never met any of the foundation board members." "Just be honest," Martha advised. "That seems to be working for you lately." As guests began to arrive, Howard kept to the background, helping elderly residents to their seats and distributing programs. He recognized several community leaders, local politicians, and business associates from his former life, people who had once sought his favor and now barely acknowledged him. Mia arrived looking radiant in her advanced pregnancy. She was speaking with the mayor when she spotted Howard. After a moment's hesitation, she approached him. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "Martha invited me," Howard explained. "I can leave if you prefer." Mia shook her head. "No, it's all right. Actually, I've been meaning to call you. The information you provided about Blackwood has been helpful. Our lawyers think his case is weakening." Before Howard could respond, a commotion at the garden entrance drew their attention. Richard Blackwood had arrived, accompanied by Vanessa and a team of lawyers. The crowd parted as they approached Mia. "Ms. Reynolds," Blackwood said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I've brought something you should see before this proceeds any further." He handed Mia the folder. As she opened it, her face paled. "What is this?" she demanded. "Medical records," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Expert testimony confirming your mother was not of sound mind when she altered her will. I thought you'd want to know before you waste any more of the foundation's money that legally should be under proper management." Howard stepped forward. "By proper management, you mean yours?" Blackwood turned, feigning surprise. "Howard. Still playing janitor, I see. This doesn't concern you anymore." "It concerns my wife's legacy and my daughter's future," Howard replied. "And those medical records are fraudulent. Eleanor was mentally sharp until the end. Her doctor will confirm it." "Her doctor isn't the only medical authority," Blackwood countered. "And the courts will hear all perspectives. Meanwhile, perhaps Ms. Reynolds should consider a settlement before this gets uglier." The threat hung in the air. Guests were watching the confrontation with uncomfortable fascination. Howard could see Mia clutching the folder, uncertainty in her eyes. At that moment, Jackson appeared at Howard's side. "Mr. Reynolds, there's an urgent call for you in the office." Grateful for the interruption, Howard excused himself. But there was no call. Instead, Jackson showed him an email that had just arrived. "The bank is calling in our loan," Jackson said, his voice tight. "They're giving us 30 days to pay in full or they'll foreclose." "Blackwood's bank," he added meaningfully. Howard understood immediately. He's attacking on all fronts. The foundation, the center he wants, everything Eleanor cared about. Howard returned to the garden, his mind racing. The ceremony was proceeding awkwardly, with Mia giving a subdued speech about the foundation's mission. Blackwood watched from the front row, a self-satisfied smile on his face. As Mia concluded her remarks, Howard made his decision. He approached the microphone, ignoring Blackwood's glare. "If I may say a few words," he began. The crowd murmured in surprise. "Many of you knew my wife, Eleanor. Some of you knew her better than I did, though I was married to her for 40 years. He paused, gathering his courage. "Eleanor was brilliant, compassionate, and yes, completely sane when she decided to disinherit me. She did it because I had lost my way. Because I had become someone she couldn't recognize, someone I can barely recognize now, looking back." The garden was silent, every face turned toward him. "What you may not know is that the Oak Ridge Senior Center is in financial trouble. Eleanor had pledged to fund its expansion before her death. Without that funding, this place that meant so much to her will close." Howard removed his watch and held it up. "This is the last valuable thing I own. It's worth about $50,000, not enough to save the center, but enough to buy time to find a solution." He turned to Blackwood. "And as for your claims about Eleanor's mental state, I have her journals from the last 2 years of her life. Every entry is lucid, thoughtful, and purposeful. I'll be providing them to Mia's attorneys, along with testimony about your attempts to manipulate the situation for your own gain." Blackwood's face darkened. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Howard challenged. You know what Eleanor documented in those journals, Richard? Every conversation she overheard between us. Including the one where you proposed we artificially inflate property values in the East Side development by spreading rumors about a toxic waste discovery on the West Side. A clear violation of securities law. The color drained from Blackwood's face. Howard had never mentioned this conversation to anyone. It had happened years ago, at a private dinner Eleanor had attended but barely participated in. He had assumed she wasn't listening. He had been wrong. I've spent my life making deals, Richard, Howard continued. This is my final offer: walk away from the legal challenge to Eleanor's will. Call off your bank. In return, those specific journal entries never see the light of day. This journey of redemption has touched your heart? We appreciate you following this story. Leave a like, share with someone who needs hope, and tell us in the comments which moment moved you most in this incredible transformation. 3 days after the confrontation at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Howard received word that Blackwood had withdrawn his legal challenge to Eleanor's will. The bank mysteriously extended the senior center's loan terms, converting it to a lower interest rate with a more manageable payment schedule. The immediate crisis had passed. Howard sold his watch anyway, using the proceeds to establish an emergency fund for the center. When Jackson questioned this decision, Howard simply said, "It's not about the money anymore." Working alongside Jackson, Sophie, and the board of directors, Howard developed a long-term sustainability plan for the center. He contacted his old business associates, not asking for personal favors but presenting them with a solid investment in the community. Several agreed to join a new corporate sponsorship program. "You know," George commented one afternoon as he watched Howard. "Update the center's financial projections. You're using the same skills you used to build your empire. The difference is what you're building now." Howard nodded, the observation striking him as profound in its simplicity. One morning in late July, Martha found Howard helping Betty with her physical therapy exercises. "You've completed 999 hours, she announced, checking her clipboard. "One more hour and you'll have fulfilled Eleanor's requirement." Howard looked up in surprise. He'd stopped counting months ago, the hours no longer feeling like an obligation but simply part of his routine. "What will you do after today?" Martha asked. Howard hadn't considered it. The stipend from Eleanor's will would continue regardless, providing him with enough to live modestly. He could walk away from the center, perhaps try to rebuild some version of his former life. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't thought about it." Martha nodded. "Well, while you're deciding, there's someone here to see you." In the reception area, Howard found Mia waiting, her pregnancy now in its final weeks. They had spoken briefly several times since the confrontation with Blackwood, but their relationship remained tentative, healing in small increments. "Dad," she greeted him, the words still sounding hesitant on her lips. "Martha said you're finishing your required hours today." "Apparently so," Howard replied. "Though I wasn't keeping track." Mia smiled slightly. Mom would find that interesting. She was very specific about the 1,000-hour requirement. They walked slowly in the center's garden, the summer flowers in full bloom. Mia explained that the foundation was thriving, with new donations coming in since Blackwood's retreat. "The lawyers say we can open Mom's final envelope for you now," Mia said, producing a sealed envelope from her purse. "The one she left to be given to you upon completion of your hours." Howard stared at it. "I'd forgotten about that. Do you want to open it alone?" Howard shook his head. "No. Whatever it is, I'd like you to be there." They sat on a bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. Howard carefully opened the envelope to find a USB drive and a handwritten note. "My dearest Howard," the note read. "If you're reading this, you've completed the 1,000 hours I asked of you. I'm proud of you, though you may find that strange after everything that's happened. The drive contains a video I recorded for you. Watch it when you're ready. With love, always, Eleanor." That evening, Howard and Mia sat in her living room, David nearby as they connected the USB drive to the television. Eleanor's face appeared on the screen, recorded in what appeared to be her study at the mansion. She looked thin but composed, her silver hair arranged neatly, wearing the blue dress Howard had always loved. "Hello, Howard," she began, her voice steady. "If you're watching this, then you've done what I asked. 1,000 hours of service to others, something the Howard I knew these past years would have considered beneath him." Eleanor smiled gently. "I don't know what those 1,000 hours have done to you, if anything. I don't know if you've changed or simply endured. But I hope I've always hoped that by stepping outside the world you built for yourself, you might remember the man you were before success hardened you." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I didn't do this out of vengeance, though you probably thought so at first. I did it because I saw you disappearing, year by year, deal by deal. The man who held my hand through labor with Mia, who taught her to ride a bike, who used to say family was his greatest achievement, that man was worth fighting for." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes, but her voice remained strong. "I forgive you, Howard. For the affairs, for the neglect, for becoming someone I no longer recognized. I forgive you because I remember who you were, and I believe that person still exists." Howard felt his own eyes burning as Eleanor continued, "I've left you the means to live simply but comfortably. What you do with the rest of your life is your choice now. But I hope you'll consider what these past months have taught you. About value. About purpose. About connection." Eleanor leaned closer to the camera. "And Howard? It's not too late to know your daughter. To meet your grandchild. To build something that will outlast both of us, not of concrete and glass, but of love and legacy." As the video ended with Eleanor's gentle smile, Howard turned to find Mia watching him, tears streaming down her face. "She never stopped believing in you," Mia said softly. "Even when I had." Howard nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. After a moment, he managed to ask, "Can we try again? You and me?" Mia reached across the space between them and took his hand. "I think that's what Mom was hoping for all along." As Howard drove back to his apartment that night, he felt lighter than he had in decades. Eleanor had given him one final gift, not punishment, but possibility. The chance to rebuild what truly mattered. Tomorrow, he would return to the center not because of a requirement, but because he wanted to. Because somehow, in cleaning floors and reading to residents and solving budget crises, he had found a purpose greater than accumulation and power. For the first time in 40 years, Howard Reynolds was looking forward to a future measured not in dollars, but in relationships healed and lives touched. Almost a year had passed since Eleanor's death. Oak Ridge had seen the seasons change, from the crisp autumn when Howard began his community service to the following summer, now ripening into early fall. Howard lived in a comfortable two-bedroom apartment, modest by his former standards but spacious enough for his needs. The walls, once bare, were now adorned with photographs Eleanor in her garden, Mia and David on their wedding day, a copy Mia had given him recently, and most prominently, a newborn baby boy, Ellis Howard Williams, born 3 months earlier. On this particular morning, Howard prepared for a special event. The Oak Ridge Senior Center was hosting a dedication ceremony for its newly completed expansion, now officially named the Eleanor Reynolds Memorial Wing. Through a combination of community fundraising, corporate sponsorships that Howard had arranged, and a matching grant from Mia's foundation, the center had not only survived but thrived. Howard dressed carefully in a new suit, not the ostentatious designer wear of his past, but a well-made, classic style that felt appropriate for his current life. As he adjusted his tie, his phone chimed with a text from Sophie, "Don't forget to pick up the cake on your way." Howard smiled. In the past year, his relationship with Sophie had evolved from cautious collegiality to genuine friendship, and recently, to something more. At 66, he had never expected to find companionship again, but Sophie's directness and compassion had gradually broken through his defenses. At the center, the atmosphere was festive. Residents in their best clothes chatted excitedly as staff made final preparations. The new wing gleamed with large windows that flooded the space with natural light, wider hallways to accommodate wheelchairs and walkers, and a state-of-the-art physical therapy room. "There you are," Martha said, approaching Howard with her clipboard. At 73, she showed no signs of slowing down, having recently agreed to join the center's board of directors alongside Howard. "Everything's ready except the guest of honor." Mia texted that they're running a few minutes late, Howard replied. "Ellis was fussy this morning." Martha nodded. "Babies operate on their own schedule, not ours." She studied Howard for a moment. "You know, I didn't believe Eleanor when she said this would work. That you would change." "I didn't either," Howard admitted. "But she knew me better than I knew myself." The ceremony began with Jackson welcoming everyone. No longer the hostile director who had once resented Howard's presence, Jackson now introduced him as the man whose business expertise and personal transformation saved this center. Howard spoke briefly about Eleanor's vision for the senior center, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. Eleanor believed that every stage of life deserves dignity, purpose, and community. This new wing isn't just a building, it's a continuation of her belief that we are never too old to contribute, to connect, and to grow. After the ribbon cutting, guests mingled in the new community room. Howard was speaking with a potential donor when Martha touched his arm. "Mia's here," she said quietly. Howard turned to see his daughter entering, David beside her carrying Ellis in his car seat. Howard excused himself and went to greet them. "Sorry we're late," Mia said, hugging him. "Someone decided his diaper needed changing right as we were leaving." "A gentleman is never rushed," Howard replied, peering at his grandson. Ellis was awake, his curious eyes so like Eleanor's taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. As David went to set up the car seat in a quiet corner, Mia handed Howard an envelope. "This was in Mom's things. Martha found it last week when they were sorting through the last of the donations. It has your name on it." Howard looked at the envelope, recognizing Eleanor's handwriting. Unlike the formal letter he'd received after completing his hours, this appeared to be a personal note. "I haven't read it," Mia assured him. It was sealed. Howard tucked it into his pocket. "I'll read it later. This moment is about celebrating what we've accomplished together." The celebration continued, with residents eagerly giving tours of the new facilities. Betty, now using a walker but still sharp-minded, proudly showed visitors the expanded library where Howard had spent countless hours reading to her. George Sullivan, looking friendlier than he had a year ago but still possessing his shrewd mind, cornered a local business owner about sponsoring a computer lab for the residents. "Howard says technology keeps the mind young," he explained. "And at my age, I need all the help I can get." As the afternoon progressed, Howard found a quiet moment to slip away to the garden. He sat on the bench beneath the dogwood tree now designated as Eleanor's bench with a small plaque and opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated just days before Eleanor's death, the handwriting shakier than her usual elegant script. "My dearest Howard, if you're reading this, Martha has found it among my things," which means enough time has passed for her to believe you're ready for these final words. "I always believed you would find your way back home, not to our house, but to yourself. To the man I fell in love with, who valued people above possessions and moments above monuments. I have no way of knowing what your life looks like now. But I hope it includes Mia. I hope it includes purpose and connection. I hope you've discovered that the measure of a man isn't in what he accumulates, but in what he contributes. Remember how you used to say the Reynolds legacy would be written in steel and glass? I always disagreed. Legacies aren't built, they're lived. They exist in the hearts we touch, the lives we improve, the love we share. I'm at peace now, Howard. And I hope you are too. Forever yours, Eleanor." Howard folded the letter carefully, his vision blurred with tears. He felt a small hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Sophie. "It's time for the toast," she said gently. Howard nodded, pocketing the letter and taking Sophie's hand as they walked back to the center. Inside, Mia was waiting with Ellis in her arms. "Would you like to hold him for the toast?" she asked. As Howard cradled his grandson, looking around at the community gathered to celebrate Eleanor's vision, he understood fully what she had given him, not punishment, but redemption. Not an ending, but a new beginning. To Eleanor, he said, raising his glass with his free hand, who taught us all that it's never too late to find our way home. This journey of redemption touched your heart? We appreciate you following this story. Leave a like, share with someone who needs hope, and tell us in the comments which moment moved you most in this incredible transformation.